What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Axioms on Trial. No green screen behind me today. I tore it down and got frustrating trying to put it back up. So yeah, this is what you get. But you get a cooler green screen below me with our guest, and then I guess the matching hat by Cease.
Yeah.
And then I have the Mortal Kombat background. So we all kind of got, something that expresses our individuality there, and so that's pretty cool. But anyway, we're going to have a pretty cool conversation with Daniel. We kind of just going to see what happens in terms of the topics and stuff. It's not really like a formally held thing with any specific thing to talk about necessarily, but we can go into either one specific topic or a bunch throughout the conversation. I haven't been on in a while. That's going to change. I'll be back on here more often, developing a schedule that works for my sleep and whatnot. But if you're not familiar or you haven't watched us, you can go on to patreon.com/Axioms on Trial to support us. We're going to hopefully get the perks in order. I tried to let some people at the beginning know that we will be a little slow on that. I think it's about that time that we're going to look at our options for perks for anybody that does want to. If not, it's always there for you just to support us. It'll go to new equipment or subscription fees for the platform I use, things like that. But if not, just hit the subscribe button. That's free, and you could do that. But anyway, Cease, why don't you give a rundown on what we're going to talk about or anything that you want to say before we start?
Yeah, so real quick, for anybody listening, I have my air conditioning on at the moment. Can you guys hear it? Like, if it's bothering anybody, just let me know and I'll go turn it off. It just says like 90-something degrees in here.
Oh, I have to cut you off, by the way. I'm sorry. Me and Cease, we didn't get to say this live. Me and Cease flew down to Atlanta. And so me and Cease actually, I don't know if anyone knows, we met online. So we met through like Discord conversations, TikTok conversations. We kind of built our friendship through getting into Discord rooms and then just kind of having different conversations with theists or atheists. And so it was really cool because Cease actually came down here and we got to hang out, go to a conference and hang out with some friends. So yeah, I will post some pictures on the community thing once I figure out how to work that on YouTube, and I'll show the picture that we got together. Anyway, enough of me. I'll shut up. You go ahead.
Sounds good. And yeah, I wish we could have done a show in person, but a lot of what's going on at the time. So, but yeah, so Daniel, why don't you give our audience a little bit of your background, share some of what it is you believe and your reasoning for it, and we can get the conversation rolling that way.
Cool. So for starters, I think before we can talk about anything, we got to establish common ground. So the main thing that struck me about you was you honestly seem to have a lot in common with me, even though we're diametrically opposed on our worldviews. So Dragon Ball Super is the best series, right? Well done.
No. For me, it's old school Dragon Ball Z.
Okay. Well, the battles are good, but I think that Dragon Ball Super mixed the humor of Dragon Ball and the action of Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah, so that's true. I think my issue with that series, well, the visuals, I'm just like so used to like the old school visuals that it's hard for me to like get on ball with that.
Yeah.
But also, it kind of like threw away the power levels to where like it almost feels meaningless.
I just, you're right, but I kind of just went, I'll just pretend that that's not there and then moved on without thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm like too OCD for that. I mean,
yeah,
don't get me wrong, it's not bad. Like, it's much better than GT was, obviously.
Oh, gosh, yes.
But no, for me, it's like old school Dragon Ball and then DBZ are like
cool. So, and then, so I actually watched a bunch of your TikTok videos specifically I found a lot that we had in common. You value critical thinking. You said you revere evidence, explanatory power, and predictive power. Feelings do not translate to facts. I agree. I think we both have a favorite Hitchens quote that I actually use all the time, which that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. That's a wonderful quote that I actually use all the time. But first, the main thing I wanted to start with was when you hear someone say faith, like I have faith in God, what do you hear? What are you hearing them say?
I think I try to not make assumptions about that kind of language, because I think ultimately it's going to mean different things for different people.
Sure.
Like for some, it's, well, I don't have to defend this with evidence. It's about being consistent with the belief.
Sure.
That's for some people. For others,
go ahead. Sorry.
For others, they've defined it as some kind of trust, not necessarily like a blind faith where you don't need any kind of justification, but a trust that somehow things are going to go okay.
Yeah.
And in the religious context, I think that both definitions are problematic.
Okay.
Obviously, the blind faith being a far more problematic one, but I don't think that. I'm of the mindset that, like, I don't ask for like proof of God, because I think that's a incorrect approach to the conversation. What I feel is that the apparent evidence or arguments provided for belief in God, to me, have all failed miserably to be anything that would remotely convince me. And it's not out of like, I don't want it to be true, because how I feel doesn't really ever come into the equation for what I believe. It's more like, if you have good reasons for something, then it will convince me. Like, I want to believe in free will, like I want to believe in an afterlife. I don't, because I haven't found anything convincing.
Sure. Okay. So I will say that before I was a Christian, I will say that the afterlife, not hell, heaven, terrified me. Which sounds weird, I know, but the idea of existing eternally, I mean, you're eventually going to get bored. So that scared me. Just something that might relate. So I didn't want there to be an afterlife in that time period, because it was a scary concept. But anyway, also it's kind of into what we're talking about. I'm really sorry about your friend. That's looked really hard, but that was the first thing that occurred to me, is that you were very angry at people trying to manipulate someone like that. And I understand, but I guess the important thing that I have to ask is, I mean, are you familiar with Penn Jillette?
Yeah.
Okay. So Penn has this quote that, so in this conversation, I believe that I'm right. I believe I have the correct view of reality. You don't believe I am. And that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with disagreeing. There's nothing wrong with asserting that our beliefs are true. If we believe them, then we would believe them. If we don't, we believe something else. But Penn's quote, I think, has to do with that thing. He's so in the context of losing someone, which is awful. I think, though, if we think we have the right worldview, then I think it's important that we don't vilify, because here's the thing. He says, I always said that I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe there's a heaven and a hell and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life, and you think that it's not really worth telling them this because it would be socially awkward, and atheists who think people shouldn't proselytize and who just leave me alone and keep your religion to yourself, how much do you have to hate someone to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? And then he says, if I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that a truck was coming at you and you didn't believe that truck was bearing down on you, there's a certain point where I tackle you, and this is more important than that. So, especially the main reason I wanted to get common ground was, if I wanted to convince someone to save their life, I think, and I could be wrong, I might be incorrect about what I believe, but I think because I believe what I do, I'm obligated to act as if I believe what I say I do, if that makes sense.
So let me do kind of a curveball. I didn't expect to go there, but let me address what you just said. I'm actually going to do a show probably tomorrow or the following day on what happened, and about, from a secular perspective, how do we deal with loss? How do we deal with death? And kind of go over, not necessarily in personal detail about the specifics of my situation, although I will discuss that to a point. But here's the thing. I agree with you, and I agree with Penn on the idea that if you really believe these things, I've never had a problem with a religious person coming up to me and telling me what they believe, and especially if they think. And I even said in those videos, I know that they think they're doing the right thing. I don't think they're motivated. But here's the difference in that particular situation. They were informed that we didn't want them there. They were told ahead of time that this was not something that we were comfortable with or wanted. It's one thing to say, like, if there is that kind of openness on both parties to have the conversation, then it's fine. Like, I think that those conversations should take place. But if you're told specifically that we are not comfortable with this, and then that consent is violated, and then the way that conversation goes is, I think there's something inherently repulsive about the idea that a God is going to be willing to save a young person from dying from leukemia only if they say, I accept Jesus Christ. To me, that kind of God, that kind of mindset is something that I find deeply repulsive. I don't have a problem engaging that conversation with somebody who's a believer, and I can do so respectfully, but not in that context, not in the context of, we gave you, we did not consent to this, and yet they tracked her down, they tracked the hospital she was staying at down, they tracked her room number down, and barged in against our wishes. That's a very different kind of situation, as far as I'm concerned.
I didn't know all that. I apologize.
No, you're fine. I'm not mad at you. I'm saying, like, if the anger that I had wasn't because some people who feel strongly about something want to have the conversation. I'm always open to that. It's the details of the situation was what resulted in my anger, because this is another way of scaring somebody who was already going through something horrible and making them feel even more alienated than they already felt. But that's, to me, what you just said is, I think the horror of religion for me is that it can make otherwise really great people, moral people, well-wishing people, do and behave in ways that I think are horrible. And that was an example of that.
I absolutely agree with you. I guess the thing that that occurs to me is so that's kind of what the gospel is, if we understand it. It's about consent. God's not going to impose himself or his existence on you if you don't want it. And in that, you're saying she didn't want it, and they did violate that. They went where they weren't wanted, and I think that was a mistake, and I don't think they should do that. But if Christianity is true the way the way that I believe it is, and the Christians believe it is, if it is true, then that matches God perfectly. God is not going to impose his existence on you unless you're willing to ask.
Oh, okay, so we've come at a crucial difference in the way that we interpret this religion, then. Because for me, theism is inherently a violation
Theism of Christianity.
I would say most forms of theism, maybe not all forms of theism, but most forms of theism, including Christianity, are, as far as I understand it, inherently, what's the word I'm looking for? Hitchens uses this term a lot. Dictatorial? I don't know if that's a word.
Totalitarian.
Totalitarian. Thank you,
Mike. Sorry.
Well, I can.
I have a habit of interrupting. I'll try not to.
No, you're fine. Well, I just want to explain.
Both of you shut up. No, just kidding. Sorry.
The reason why I feel that way is, I didn't ask to exist. I didn't ask for the circumstances that will lead to heaven or hell. It's one thing to say, you don't have to worship me. It's another thing to say that if you don't follow this set of commandments, that there are consequences to those choices that you didn't elect or vote on, or come into agreement with. It's not like I'm not rejecting. I think this is a common misconception from Christians towards atheists. I'm not rejecting the idea of God as a matter of principle, or like I have some kind of personal, like, I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I've been told a lot, well, you just don't believe because you don't want to be held accountable, or you don't believe because you want to sin. It's none of that. I don't believe because I've seen nothing that convinces me, and what I find convincing isn't something that I choose. It's just a state of affairs. Like, you're just not convincing. In fact, like I said, especially in a situation like what I just went through, I would love nothing more than to have evidence towards the belief that I'm going to see this person again someday, that there's going to be, things are somehow going to be okay down the line. So it's not that like I just reject the gospel. I reject it because I'm not convinced by it. It's not to do with what I want or consent in that matter. So.
Sure. That makes sense to me. And also, I think that skepticism serves people. I think without skepticism, we make mistakes in what we believe. I think if I'm prepared to make a claim now, I think the claim that I would make is that you've never met, or at least weren't aware of meeting an actual Christian. I know that sounds like an odd claim to make, but you said that the theism that you're familiar with, but that doesn't match what I know to be Christianity. It doesn't match it at all. I will say, statistically speaking, there's like an incredibly low amount of people in the world that actually adhere to a biblical worldview as far as currently. And I can post comments or whatever you want to where I'm getting my statistics.
Well, that's actually, it's interesting you said, because that's kind of where my concern lies with the whole thing. Because it's, my question is, if I have Christian A and Christian B, like Daniel, and then somebody else, presumably both of you will kind of make a similar statement if you hold antithetical.
But I can defend my case.
Yeah, and what I'm worried about, I guess, is like in the other case, I don't see that they aren't going to use the same tools for them to assert that the interpretation that they take aligns with what the speaker actually meant.
I think there's always a gap there, like how you interpret the text and how they interpret the text. And I might even agree with your interpretation in my reading more so than theirs. But I don't see how there is like an objective tool to say, well, this is the right interpretation and there's the wrong one. How do we get to that point? Like, how do we bridge that?
So you're talking about who has epistemic rights to believe what they're saying, right? Their interpretation.
I'm talking about how we compare and contrast interpretations to say the one, like, how do we know what the speaker meant or what the writer meant?
I mean,
the author meant.
Because the case that I would give, like, if I wrote some story about Cease and a bunch of people read it and it was sarcastic, and Cease just like read it and he's laughing like, man, this guy, like, he's saying all this stuff, and then you read it and you're like, wow, Mike's kind of an ass. Like, he's talking a lot of crap about Cease. Cease is laughing because he knows the background information about me, right? He knows a lot about the speaker in this case. One being that he knows I'm joking. He can interpret the sarcastic remarks as such because he has the background information of me. And so that will aid in his interpretation of what I actually meant. But with God, I don't know, like, how is it that you adjudicate that that's what God meant versus another Christian if your source of what God even is that text in the first place? Because that's just going to raise this kind of circular problem about how you could even know what God's intentions are in the first place.
Sure. So what you're saying is that the background information that Cease has, which is the context, allows you to know what you meant with your paper, right?
It increases the probability of his interpretation being right over, say, you, who might take a literal interpretation that I'm actually just being mean.
Sure, but there's a threshold of understanding where he can be convinced that he knows what you mean, whereas I do not have the context.
Yeah, because
Okay,
he can
so
have access to me as like an actual way to like he has
Like-
background information, like some.
Like I can go and I can ask Mike what is.
I'm saying without asking, you can actually make an interpretation that's presumably justified because you have a data set in the past about how I am, who I am, what kind of things I say, my intentions when I speak, and then say inside jokes or sarcastic remarks that I make that you interpret correctly that someone else otherwise would.
I think even then, I'll go a little bit farther. I think I agree with you, but I think even then there is an ambiguity with language where interpretations are always tentative and always somewhat problematic. Now we can have interpretations that I think have more justification than others, like the example you just gave. But I think in general, it's always a linguistic problem that we run into in all literature.
okay, so what you're saying, and I agree, when it comes to critical thinking, is that we should have justifications for why we believe what we do, and I absolutely agree. But I can tell you, I have the context to understand things regarding the New Testament. I know archaeological information. I know how the transmission of the documents works. I can track that. I can see how it didn't change over the years. So that's a very large box that we would have to.
Well, but one of those boxes that I'd be interested in right away is that I'm not, this is an example off the top of my head, but I'm not convinced because I guess my pushback is going to be that we can actually show where it's changed, like.
Okay, my question is, if you can show where it's changed, how do you know? How do you know? Don't you have to know what the original is in order to know that it changed?
Well, yeah. So the process is something called docile reproduction or editorial fatigue, and the idea is that in like Mark, for example, in Mark 6 versus Matthew 14, you get the story of John the Baptist, the beheading of John the Baptist. Sorry. And so what ends up happening in Mark is the detailing of Herod Antipas as a king, and we don't have to really necessarily worry about that right there. But in Matthew, the stories change where Herod Antipas is a tetrarch. And if you like go Google Herod Antipas, you'll even see like a little blurb. I mean, this might not have any weight for you, but just to point out that this is a pretty common understanding, that the first thing you'll see on the blurb to the right is Herod Antipas, often referred to as a king in the New Testament, despite the fact that he was a tetrarch. The distinction there being a ruler that rules four provinces, or four different rulers that rule different provinces, versus say like a king that rules all the land. And what you get in Matthew is you get this, it's like a smart move that the writers change it to tetrarch because that's actually correct. But what happens in 14:9 is, and this happens with different stories too, is they'll weave back into the original author, or the authors that they're using, in this case being Mark's writings, because 14:9 leaves in the line, the king was deeply grieved. And you wouldn't make this type of change, this like distinct change of a tetrarch to king, and then revert back into the language of your source if it wasn't the source that you're using. And it's not just like one example. We can use this with like the man with leprosy, right? We get Matthew bringing in all these crowds, and then he leaves the line, run off and don't tell anybody, which doesn't make any sense because he's added all these crowds. So you can go down the line and you end up getting these changes, right? But then you also see in the context of what source they're using that they changed, because it's what's called editorial fatigue. They're fatigued with their source and they end up making little errors in the manuscripts. But so the point being is that I would find these subtle errors and say, well, they have been changed. So the interpretation now is going to have a whole different kind of branching issue.
Okay, so there are minor changes throughout the Gospels, at least the manuscripts that we have. There are punctuation errors, word changes, things like that.
Sure.
But if we're talking about Christianity and the way that it's unique from every other religion, is it's making a claim about history. It's claiming that Jesus Christ lived, died, and claimed to be God himself. Now, you can disagree that he didn't say those things, but the earliest Christians from the beginning, their writings indicate that's what they believed they were being told. That's why they converted to Christianity. So if it's making a claim, it's not saying this thing way down the line. It's claiming the people that were present at the time, and they're saying that this is the facts. So does any part of that, is it difficult to understand because the word king or tetrarch is not used?
No, it's just a cast in, like, so when you say that, you can go and look at these changes or whatever, there's going to be people that interpret that, like, so for example, you might just concede and say it's a minor kind of variant, and another Christian's going to say that that's not a variant at all, right? They're actually, the word is referring to the same exact thing. And they might
Well, it appears to be because it's functionally the same, isn't it?
But there are,
but it's not. It's not, because a king. So this is different between different, like, I think they're called dialectianic arrangements. I think that if I got that right, you might have to check me on that. But the idea is that they are very distinct arrangements that are going to make a huge difference in terms of antiquity, because saying that Herod Antipas was a king would just be factually wrong.
Well,
right? And that would mean the writers of Matthew were wrong, or at least they just referred to him as a king. But then if we just shelve that issue, the issue is that in Matthew, they used both the terms, but they made an effort in the first place to change it. And we see this kind of fatigue. My issue is just to point out that we already have an issue with knowing what the intent of the speaker is. And then we have other kind of variant issues that are going to just branch off from that. But that's not as important to me, because like C said, it's really going to come down to Christian A thinks, interpretation is this. And let's use like Jesus is God, because not all Christians agree with that. Well, it's one thing for one Christian just to, well, I was going to say, it's one thing for a Christian just to say they're not Christians. The other one might say the same thing. And what's left for me, especially as a non-believer, and I think it's actually for them, because this is their thing that they believe in, they need to adjudicate for all parties exactly how they know that aligns with God's intentions. Because my fear and what I've seen is that they appeal to the same exact things. And it's like, if it's the Holy Spirit, well, the Holy Spirit tells them that, or if it's God told me this, well, God tells you this, that. And I'm left as a non-believer going, well, is the Holy Spirit a liar, or does it not exist? Right? Because it can't be giving you both false information, or else it's just a deceiver.
I agree with that entirely.
Yeah. So what would you, yeah, sure. Cease, go ahead. But I guess just to put it down to the floor, my concern is what actually is the independent attestation? Because we can't go to the text, right? And then if we assume a rule thing, well, because that's what's in question, right? Because if we go to the text, then we're going to go back into the interpretation issue of whether or not the background information you're getting about God is actually the right interpretation of it.
There's always a gap there with the language, but what I would point to is I don't see, as far as like the way that I understand evidence or how I look at ideologies, I don't see the relevance in any of that, because I can accept, let's say that somehow we had access, let's say the text hadn't changed. And let's say that we had access to what the authors really meant. And that we knew for a fact that all the people who lived at the time genuinely believed in these miracles and in the resurrection and in Jesus being God. And that was their genuine belief. None of that, from my perspective, would be convincing, because people are often misguided about their intuitions in the context of how those intuitions correspond to reality. People have died for beliefs that I think they held honestly, but that I don't find had real justification for.
Sure.
For example, I don't consider the 500 to be a historical fact, and I have reasons for that. But let's say that it was. Let's say that we had not 500. Let's say that we had 5,000 so-called eyewitnesses of Jesus' work and the resurrection, all these things. Why would that not be convincing to me? Am I just being like hyper skeptical? No, I don't think I am, because when we look at the way in which people form beliefs, we look at things like the miracle of Fatima, where we had a vast number of people think that we're witnessing a miracle in front of them. And then it turned out to be, science can actually explain this visual phenomena that took place, and that these people were actually misguided about what they believed. Or let's take certain Indian gurus like Sathya Sai Baba, who 10 years ago, or maybe I think 15 years ago, this wasn't like people in a culture or a context of what's the word I'm thinking of? Or in a context of superstition, but a context of college-educated, somewhat scientifically minded individuals who went to India, met this so-called prophet and now believe that he was a walking God on earth.
That sounds ridiculous.
So, people can believe very strongly by the thousands, by the millions, even things that they actually can't justify as being as corresponding to reality and being anything but just their imagination. So even if you were right and you had the interpretation, why should that convince me?
Sure. I think that's an excellent question. So if we're hypothetically entertaining the possibility that the documents haven't changed and that these people didn't see it, I guess you're asking, how do we know they really saw what they say they saw, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I guess the easiest answer is understanding the context, which is what we were talking about earlier. So when you're asking about the questions and justification for why people believe what they believe or whose interpretation is right, if someone says someone's interpretation is wrong, well, they have to defend their case. And so, which I think you would agree with. If you have an interpretation of any document you've read and someone says, well, that's just your interpretation, well, the one who has the correct interpretation ought to be able to defend it. So in the same way, I would have to defend it. I agree. So I think that the answer is just to understand all the context, what's going on. So with that being the case, you have people who are Jews who already have a religion, who already think that if they don't listen to what their local Pharisee says, they're not going to get eternal life. They're going to be spat on by the rest of their family. They're going to have all these horrible circumstances. And you're absolutely right. People do die and martyr themselves for things they thought was true. Absolutely. But what doesn't happen, never, people who invent a story and then try to get fame and fortune and whatever off of it, they are not willing to die for that belief if they invent it. And
well, no, I don't think he would push back on that.
Well, let me finish real quick. Just saying that that doesn't make a case as 100%. It's a collection of details. That's just one detail that's interesting to me that gets my attention.
Yeah, I would, because for me, I would just say I believe that they really believe that, right?
Yeah,
still doesn't indicate truth. Like, because all that's being expressed is that there's a proposition. And what the proposition is that they believe Jesus was the Son of God and resurrected, right? And they believe that proposition to be true. Okay, that's great. But when I'm told that they're willing to die for it, all that tells me is that they just really, really think it's true. And when I'm talking about knowledge, I'm not talking about just holding the belief and having confidence. I'm talking about the belief being true and being justified, because it's going to be justified true belief, presumably. I mean, if we throw away like Gettier cases for just the brevity of the argument, or for the brevity
based on
of,
your thing, you've got trial, right? Like you're, as you think a court's important, and determining truth is important. Going to a court case to determine guilt, things like that. Certain people get justified to determine that yes, this person is in fact guilty, and then they will admit to their crime later on after but they found out that the fact, they convinced the jury, they brought up the evidence, they convinced the case. But so yeah, them believing it is not enough. But the question is, what were they willing to give up? And if they were convinced, like, okay, I'm not saying because they were willing to give up, or to give up everything, because like I said, they could have been mistaken, I suppose. But that's people that were convinced secondarily. The people that were there primarily, the evidence seems to indicate that they denied all of it. They gave up. They went home. They cried. They were ready to give up. They didn't believe in their Jesus. Nothing would bring them out of their lethargy until Jesus showed himself. And that's a life-changing thing, which seems to indicate something changed. What? Like, why would they do all of this for a lie? Anyway, but the reason it's I'm not going to keep going. I apologize. Just it's not that
it's two of us and one of you. So I was just saying that. Yeah, definitely go ahead, because you we talk at length. So no worries.
Yeah. Well, for me, it wasn't convincing, even after I was convinced of Jesus, and until first I was convinced that a God exists. And I think that can be done. I think that there's evidence of supernatural events. Like, I think the Big Bang is a supernatural event by definition. But that led me to believe in a God first. And once a God was possible, or at least it seemed to be a part of this universe, then it seemed more plausible, the case that they were making regarding Jesus. But Cease looks like he was going to say something.
Yeah, so a number of things. Well, I'll go backwards. The Big Bang is simply the point at which known physical law breaks down. there's no reason to call, from my understanding of it, as to call it a supernatural event. It's something that it's where our understanding of physical reality breaks down. Some people think that
often repeated, but my question is, if natural laws break down, but it began, that would seem to indicate an unnatural occurrence.
Well, no, break down as far as like what we can understand about what happened or didn't happen.
Began is also kind of thrown in there because like it's not the case that we go to the Planck time and we were talking like 0 to 10 to like the negative 36 seconds or negative 10, whatever it is, a trillionth of a second. It's not, that doesn't necessarily indicate like a beginning point. That's just going to indicate.
Okay, but if there's not a beginning point, time itself is meaningless because you have an infinite point backwards. You could never arrive at today if time was infinite backwards. It wouldn't even make sense.
So what I would say is,
I don't find those arguments to be compelling, at least like the Grim Reaper style, like, because what would be the contradiction in infinite, traversal?
Well,
I don't really
if you're looking at infinite and a line segment, and it goes infinitely this way and infinitely this way, this is meaningless because where do you find a point if there's no like segment between 2 points? You can measure that. Between no 2 points, you can't measure that. So if we're talking time is going forward, how could you ever measure a point in time?
But those are just arbitrary. Well, so there's a number of things. One, it's unclear. This idea of time going forward is itself problematic. Two, when we talk about measurements, we're just talking about kind of an arbitrary look at how we choose to break down points that may be arbitrary. Three, I'm not saying the option isn't between a beginning, and like a set point of beginning, or an infinite regress. There are other models in physics of certain kinds of universes that are self-contained. I'm not saying I believe any one option. I'm saying that the way in which you're referring to time here, and I would urge you to go examine the episodes that we have on the channel with the black hole cosmologists and physicists that we've had on, where he goes into the way in which most of our intuitions about time are problematic in light of what physics currently seems to suggest. It's a very different thing that's brought forth. But kind of moving backwards from that to what you also said about what people were willing to give up, I would never and have never stated that I think people died for what they knew was a lie.
But that's what has to be the case. Like either they believed it or they invented it.
No, I would say they believed it. I'm convinced that they were genuine in their convictions. I don't think that anybody died for something they didn't think was true. What I'm saying is that them thinking it was true isn't itself an additional piece of evidence to judge whether or not they were justifying their beliefs, because of the fact that we can all be so easily misled about our beliefs about the world.
Sure, I agree. That actually reminds me of a quote from you that seems at play, and correct me if I'm wrong, but let's see, let me find it. It's not a bad quote. I'm not like going, "Aha, I got you" or anything like that. Sure. Let's see.
While you pull it up, I was curious though, because I don't know that the problem wouldn't just equally affect your view.
Why would it?
Is God finite?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, so I don't know why couldn't somebody just rival some type of necessary natural thing or whatever, right? That
well,
has
natural
the same type of
by definition means inside of time, space, and matter. So,
well, I don't necessarily. It's not. That's going to assume some view that they're holding, but if they hold some view like Graham Oppy, right, who believes in some necessary entity that is not supernatural, doesn't have intentions or something like that, I just don't know what would, like, why someone, if you take like an actual infinity or something like that to be some issue, I just don't get why, like, this doesn't pose issues for naturalists or other people, right? Because I'm not seeing like a contradiction. I'm just seeing something that could equally apply to whatever view you have to some naturalist view, and you just strip away intentions or something like that.
Why wouldn't an infinite God, why wouldn't the term infinite or the description of infinite be a problem for a notion of God the same way that it would for a notion of the universe?
Well, because an infinite universe that we are inside of, I mean, I look around, I see time, space, and matter. I can feel what I'm empirically verify what I'm inside. And I mean, people may argue about time not being forward, but I mean, that seems to defy common sense. Like, tomorrow happens, and we're using words to describe an abstract, surely, but like tomorrow happens, I can think back about the future. There doesn't seem to be another direction for time to go. And for tomorrow to come, it has to...
but that's precisely what physics are saying is not the case, or our physicists are saying are not the case, right?
So they're measuring time space and making predictions from it, which you said predictions matter. And
of course they matter. But it's like if you talk about someone traveling at some speed and you're given, like, I have a friend who has a TikTok who has he's actually like he has a background, I don't know if it's in cosmology, what it is specifically, but he shows this on a diagram on how we typically view time to be linear, and then gives points about how someone's going to be in some equal distance of or in the same type of spot on the graph as an event in the future, despite the fact that like you haven't actually traversed that event yet, right?
Sure, people have all kinds of theories, but to me that makes no sense. Like,
well, I know, but my problem with that though is that would just be an argument from incredulity or ignorance, right?
I don't think it's an argument from incredulity, because I'm not saying that's preposterous. I'm saying I can experience time and I don't see a reason to question, because tomorrow comes.
But mind-dependent, you would agree, mind-dependent notions of perception is not mind-independent notions of how the world actually works, right?
I don't know what you mean.
So your perception is mind-dependent. It depends on like you and your perception. But you would agree,
but reality exists.
Reality is
what my perception is.
Exactly. And so time like that, if you have a perception of time or causality, and we just find out that our notions of causes and our notions of time just aren't the way that we perceive it, then I just don't know what the argument is outside of that. Because it just seems like I intuit it, and that doesn't seem to be very forceful to me.
Well, if it wasn't that, if you're saying that, then what you're saying is common sense. People don't question causality on their day-to-day. Nobody does. Everybody knows.
David Hume did.
Well, no, he didn't, because he still walked outside. He still ate his food. David Hume never questioned causality when it came to his normal life.
He did. He precisely the distinction that I'm making is that there's a mind-dependent notion that, yeah, of course, like I can be a solipsist, right, and know that I'm like, I'm the only one in the world, or I'm a brain in a vat, but still go in my daily life with my experience, acting as if I have the experience. It would still just be the case that I think mind independently, I'm a brain in a vat. There are people that do hold that position, and they have relationships.
I'm not arguing about that position. I'm just talking about causality. If a person,
I'm just saying the same thing applies, is all I'm saying. It's a mind-dependent perception, which doesn't indicate truth. It just indicates that you intuit.
Then what would indicate any form of truth at all?
So independent cooperation. I mean, we're going to have to use our minds, obviously, but it's going to have to be independent cooperation, not just perceptual intuition.
I agree with you, Daniel, that what is being described by physics is, to some degree, to a real degree, like to a severe degree, in conflict with our intuitions and our day-to-day perception of our reality. But I think that's the point, right? Is that a lot of our intuitions about the world, when we examine them in the most, to the most specific degree possible, some of those notions start to crumble.
Sure.
And so, the way in which you're describing time, it's not like physicists are just like kind of, and I'm sure that you know that the word theory in science isn't just, oh, here's a possibility.
Sure.
It's here's a wide collection of facts. Here's a model that tries to explain those facts with experiments and a level of both empirical and predictive power and all those things. There are reasons why their view of time is so different than our intuitive view of time. And like I said, I would urge you to go back to, and I mean, I would love to have you back on and have my brother on here, and kind of we can sort of go through the details of that specific issue, like of time. And
could I just comment on one part of that? So you're valuing predictive power, but that kind of requires time. And anybody that, because predictive, think about it, it's talking about something in the future to exist. So it's necessary to assume cause and effect to even make the argument. It's necessary to assume cause and effect to come to any of those conclusions. It's necessary to assume cause and effect to make any of those theories, because they have to collect the facts and then make a projection. But that requires a relationship of to and from. You can't do.
Yes, but it's not a to and from where there's this linear, like the past is gone and the future is yet to come. Because the way in which, again, and I'm a layman, like I feel uncomfortable even talking about this specific part of the issue because I'm not an expert. But from my understanding, from having had an expert on here, what the theory seems to suggest is that
appeal to authority fallacy. Sorry.
If you move, true.
I'm just
if you move backwards, they're so predicting at this point that like if you change from what we think is a cause to an effect, from the effect to the cause, and you kind of like, so I drop a glass on the ground and the glass shatters, right? And the way in which we perceive that is, well, the cause of the glass shattering is the fact that I dropped it. Well, in physics, if you rewind that tape from the glass coming from the ground back into my hand, well, nothing there seems to violate the laws of physics in terms of time. Like there is, time doesn't seem to be this like linear past to the future thing. It seems like an analogy I've been given is there's chapters in a book, all the chapters exist in a sense simultaneously. We read the book and the story from one point to the next, but there's not this idea that one is causing the next is not actually really. It's an emergent interpretation, but not actually a fundamental reality of the book itself.
So sorry.
The last thing I was going to say was there's nothing about looking at causality as an emergent feature rather than a fundamental one that actually results in the crumbling of science the way you're assuming. They're not saying let's do away with cause and effect altogether. They're saying that cause and effect isn't quite what we think it is, and time isn't quite what we think it is. So they're kind of a different move they're making.
So I think that it's possible, but I think that I think Hitchens says it best. Again, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, and I don't see any reason to doubt cause and effect as being binding on the reality that I exist in.
So I would. So what I would say is, I would urge you to examine modern physics. Maybe look at the episodes that we've had with the physicists.
That's why I'm at this conclusion, though, is studying modern physics and what physicists say on both sides of the spectrum, and every single one of them seems bound by by cause and effect to even make the conclusions. That
so let me ask: do you think that they're saying that cause and effect is fundamental?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Like causality is like fundamental. Maybe metaphysically fundamental might be
like from past to the future. Is
yeah,
the
like it's a feature of from point to end, or kind of a. Hey, CP's a physicist.
I still don't know what I mean. I'd
hesitate. So the idea that I've heard from
I'm answering.
Well, because I'm not a physicist either. I have no like I get more into biology, but even there, I'm not going to say I have like any expertise. But from my understanding, that at least in the one people I've talked to, so it's just based on experience and what I've read, obviously. But the notion seems to be pretty consistent that this is some fun or some emergent feature, right? That this isn't.
How do you define emergent?
So that it's more of like. How do I say this? Like you're suggesting that the modern physics is basically.
I was going to say something novel from, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, from my understanding, what you're saying is that modern physics is saying that there is a real, like, past causing a future.
Time.
And what I'm saying, and again, and I've had a number of physicists on the show so far, is that doesn't seem to be the picture of modern physics, and that they have provided experimental evidence as to why these ideas are in some way outdated. I think maybe on the aspect of time, it would be more beneficial, for the sake of our conversation, to maybe have you back on with an actual physicist that can go into the details far better than certainly Mike and I can. Would you be okay with that? Like with putting on hold that aspect of the conversation until we can have a...
Sure. I think that, I mean, it wouldn't bother me. He's obviously going to know more than I am regarding physics. But I think either way, whatever he can say, he's going to require time to convince me of it. And time just seems like I can experience it. I mean, I think we should not ignore what seems apparent. And I guess no matter what he can say, he's still bound by time to do it. He has to use cause and effect to convince me what caused me to believe what he has to say, what caused him to believe what he says, what experiments did he perform in the order of events that he performed them to come to the conclusion that he came to. Time still seems something that he can't escape. Whatever. And I think that any physicist, if they have, well, and so regarding worldviews, if we have a starting point, we can have all the facts and still come to the wrong conclusion if our starting point is wrong. Even if we're talking about just a map that tells you go left, right, whatever. But if you're starting from the wrong direction, you're going to end up at the wrong place. So, I mean, you could very well have a physicist, and I mean, I'm glad to. I don't care, whatever. But I suppose it's less a physics question to me and more a philosophical one, because if you're talking about time existing, I believe that experiential evidence, empirical evidence tells me that time exists. I can't touch it, but I mean, to deny time is deny cause and effect.
I think that's where we would exactly pinpoint, like, at least the difference I have, because that's where I jump off the ship. I don't put stock into like what I intuit, because it's just not the case that things that I intuit.
Then how do you determine anything?
Like, well, of course I have to intuit some things, right? But the problem is that I can't just start and end my investigation at an intuition.
Sure, but I'm not. I'm experiencing time right now. I'm watching the time.
That's what I mean, though. It can't start and end with just this experience that you just perceive. That's not
sure. It's experiential data, but if I can measure it, I can perform tests on it. Time is necessary to perform tests on it. It's like every scientific.
That presuppose your notion of like this, because like the idea there would be to find out like how it works if it's linear. But it seems that like when you engage with that, you're kind of presupposing the way that it works.
Sure. The way that it says axioms on trial. So I assume that means what axioms are valid and which aren't. And I think there are certain presuppositions that we all have to have. Like, does truth exist? Because if truth doesn't exist, then, I mean, what's the point of talking about any of this? There's no reason to determine anything. I think we have to assume that truth exists to even have a conversation. So yeah, there are axioms, but I don't think time is an axiom. I think that you can test it. You can.
Well, I guess I'm worried that there's not any independent evidence that would change your mind on that fact. And if that's the case, just from something that's a component or building block for your belief that Jesus rose, or
and I don't think
theism, real fast, because if you're saying that this is part of the building block of that, but there wouldn't be anything that independent, because it's your notion that you're taking stock in is a seeming or a mind dependent intuition, then I'm concerned, because if that one roadblock can't actually provide you any alternative justification for a different view or an antithetical view, then you would never change your
well, unfortunately, you could say that about anything you've said today. I mean, anything that you've said is based on the same problem. So maybe, but I mean, that doesn't help you either.
I would just ask you, would there be something, rather than just straw man your position? Like, would there be any type of independent justification that would allow you to have a different analysis of like time or causation? Okay, because that's my concern.
I mean, the problem I would have is it's like asking if someone says the statement "truth," there's no truth. They've already contradicted themselves. So to me, I kind of have what
I agree with you there.
Yeah. So if someone tries to work within apparently a time-space reality as it appears to me and argue that time doesn't exist, I'd have a lot harder time believing that.
So I guess I get that, because an eliminative materialist is someone that might say we don't have beliefs, and then when they're expressing that to you, you're going to say, well, that's like a performative contradiction.
Well, let me clarify.
But they're going to respond with yeah, but I'm just using a fictionalist notion, right? Like it's still illusory that I have beliefs, and I'm expressing what you take to be a belief, but that's part of the illusory nature of us being, of eliminativism being true about beliefs and
let me just
desires.
clarify too, because I'm not arguing that, or not claiming that physicists are saying time doesn't exist. I'm saying that what they're describing time to be is a different thing than our intuitive notions of time. That's a different claim. They're not saying that time isn't a thing altogether. They're saying that it's a different type of thing than what we assume it is. That's a very different thing.
Well, I think that it was a big realization to realize that space and time appear to be the same thing. So that's certainly
Sure.
that's certainly a revelation for them to realize.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the question is, regardless of what things we can come up with about what time might not be, the question is, does it go backwards and forwards? And I think that's pretty apparent. We measure time in years, and now that's an abstract, certainly, but I mean, we couldn't measure or do anything without it. So I think we're stuck with that.
Moving away slightly from the
Sure, we've been on a long time.
physics.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
All right. We all agree we're not physicists.
I think this particular part of the conversation would be more beneficial for the audience with having physicists on here that can kind of clear up some of the, the ways in which we look at.
You should find a Christian physicist too, just to get a.
Yeah, that actually would be that'd be really interesting. That'd be a really interesting conversation.
So we actually had one on here.
I'm talking about with David. That would be really cool.
Yeah, with David, that would be great.
Yeah. Or with his other friend that was on.
Yeah, but I guess let's kind of shift towards this idea of the resurrection. What convinces you that event took place? Every time I hear somebody say that it's like a historical event, I immediately twitch because I think that,
I don't blame you.
As a matter of principle, history can't make claims about the supernatural. I'm not saying that I know the supernatural doesn't exist. I'm saying that I think history can only deal with what has already been empirically supported in the first place. It can only talk about probability of likelihood. How can we attribute likelihood to something that we haven't empirically verified?
So when you say empirical verification, we haven't empirically verified it. So I don't know about you, but I define a supernatural event as something that can't be measured scientifically.
Okay.
If they occur at all. So to me, it seems to be a category error to suggest that a supernatural event could be empirically verified anyway. I mean, you might be able to see something that, and then hypothetically, if something in your living room happened against the laws of nature right in front of you, I mean, you'd have the same problem that you're telling me, though. Like, you saw it, you knew it happened hypothetically, and it's in the history now. No one can empirically verify it. Even if you know and you're ready to die to say, I saw that happen, it seems like you've boxed in yourself and not allowed for the possibility of anyone to prove it to you or prove it for you. So it seems like you're limiting yourself, I suppose.
So I think we've hit the crucial issue here. And in some way, what you've just described is exactly why I'm an atheist. It's not my claim that, miracles are impossible, or that God is impossible, or that resurrection. I have no way. I would never say that. I think anything is possible. The only thing that matters to me is
circles. Sorry.
Outside of, I guess, outside of something like that.
I'm just being a dick.
What matters is, how do we justify one claim over the next, and what tools can we show or can we use to show that something isn't purely in our imagination? And so if you tell me that we have no way to use the scientific tools to ground something like a resurrection, because you're saying that it's in principle a category error, well, then what can we use? Like, what can you tell me that will convince me that your belief in a resurrection isn't purely imaginary? Like, what tools can I have to justify that?
So if you've ruled out the tools from the beginning, there's nothing that I could possibly do to convince you.
And what are those tools that you would refer to?
Well, you said you've said from the beginning that you can't empirically test it. So then you ask, well, since you can't empirically test it, which means to be able to measure it now in front of me, then by definition, I will not be able to convince you.
Not just measuring now in front of me, because I think there are aspects of scientific theories that aren't empirical, although I think you still need that empirical basis. But I think some ability to analyze the event to show that it wasn't just in my imagination, because I could see Jesus in front of me right now, like I could have a vision of Jesus standing in front of me. How would I know that what I'm seeing isn't just a product of my mind as opposed to corresponding to something true in reality?
Or a
Do
success.
you believe that your mother exists?
Say that again?
It's a dumb question, but it's to set up something. Do you believe your mother exists?
Sure.
Okay. So you have empirically verified that. That convinced you. But what you're saying now is if you empirically saw it yourself, how would you convince? And I don't see an opportunity to do that. If you saw it, you're by yourself in your room. It's not a private event. There's no way that you could convince any of us that you actually saw Jesus in your living room. Even if you were willing to die for it because you're by yourself in that theory, you're in that claim. You're by yourself. It's a private thing. The thing that distinguishes Christianity, and this is at least the earliest claims, is that it wasn't a private event; it's a public event. Muhammad, we distinguish ourselves from claims like Muhammad and Joseph Smith because they had a claim that happened with their friend, and their friend, it's just like he said, and they can't verify it, and the text showed up 200 years after the events. But there's ways or at least tools that we can use to verify the events of the Gospels, at least the important ones. Obviously, there are details that we would be unsure about, but like there are certain things that at least prove that the information contained in the Gospels had to have happened before 70 AD. Now we can get further than that with more things and other details that it would take way too long to go over. But that puts us pretty close, at least where people could still be alive from when it happened, based on things that are described that people would not know had they not been around prior to 70 AD, since the Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD.
So there's two fundamental issues that I have with what you just said, with the analogy you made. Because the example of with my mother, I don't believe she exists just because like I can get up and I can see her. It's a collective.
Can I pause for a second?
Yeah.
I will say that I was going somewhere with that, and then I forgot, and that's why the analogy had nothing to do with anything. I apologize.
Oh, no, you're fine.
I did that the other day, and then I'd forgotten when I got off the phone with somebody, I was like, I didn't even express the point at all.
Yeah, I was setting something up, and I don't even know what it was. It's gone now. But sorry, go ahead.
The problem, however, is that it's been shown to be the case, to be a real psychological phenomenon, that people can be deceived on a massive scale. That's the problem. So It's not just that, like, oh well, like it's not just me. It's not just me that sees my mother. It's her friends and the people that she works with at her church and stuff like that. Like there is a collective thing where we can compare and contrast our experiences of the phenomena we're experiencing.
He can call his mother.
So, yeah, well, okay, so I remember at least sort of what I was talking about. So I agree with you. Yeah, there's ways to verify what you're saying, and people do all collectively claim they've seen things whenever.
But even then, it is a problem, right? Because
it's a problem, absolutely. So, but I don't believe that people can have group dreams. That doesn't happen, and I don't believe that people who. Here's the other thing. One thing that never happens is ever. This never happens. Whenever people are claiming about an event and they're separated, once they separate, details get confused, things get mixed up. But I mean, it appears that the apostles, they never recanted their story. Their stories never contradicted each other across thousands of miles across the Roman Empire. And to me, that's pretty interesting. If they can maintain that type of consistency, and because there's
if they had the copies of the manuscripts, like I cited earlier, I don't really see the force of it.
What?
I don't see the force of it if things can be corroborated really easily. Like it just rules out how we can, like, well, A, we have a gap, so we really don't know, right? And then two,
what do you mean we have a gap? What do you mean we have a gap?
Well, because you said that we could trace it back to. So there you go. Spartan said it. You say you could trace it back to pre-70, but I don't know that's the case.
No,
I
not
think
370, 70 AD.
Okay, but then, like, how is that corroborated to be trustworthy, right?
Okay, so we have documents of now this is, again, none of this is going to convince you because you've already ruled out the possibility. But
I haven't ruled out the possibility.
No.
Well,
No.
you said that if you can't empirically verify it, then that we wouldn't find it convincing. So that seems to me a ruling out the possibility, isn't it?
I didn't say that it wasn't, but
Not you. I thought.
Well, my thing there would be that if you have some other way to verify something, then you just have to offer the tool.
Let me just
It's
clarify.
like I'm building a house with the hammer, and you say we should use a different tool.
Well, yeah, I would say that too. Like I'm still.
You know what I mean? But when we inquire about it, it seems like you can't even take me to Lowe's to look at where it's at.
The question ultimately is eyewitness ever reliable? And my uncle gave me this great example that he tried to use to destroy eyewitness testimony. He's like, okay, well, me and my 3 friends were coming home from an event, and we saw this kitten, and it was dying, and it was in so much pain, and so we put it out of its misery. But then when we got home, we were arguing over what color the cat was, and we were arguing about the who killed the cat, whichever one of us did it, and all that stuff. And my response was, okay, so you're right, you're confused on some details, but obviously we know for a fact there was a cat, and it died. So that's what I'm saying we can do. I can
concede that Jesus existed and died. I can't concede that people's experiences that they reported that we're supposed to take is actually the case. Because
I agree with you. If you've got I agree that it's difficult to accept. But
because it's like, because if I asked you, like, with your wife or somebody that you trust, and we don't have to get personal, but like someone you trust, it doesn't seem that like you would. Maybe you would. I mean, would you believe them if they saw the risen Elvis or something?
But that wasn't the case that we're talking about here. I'm not trusting someone else's word. It'd be my own eyes over someone else's. Someone will die for what someone else told them, but no one's going to die for something they saw.
You had a personal revelation because hold on real quick. You had a personal revelation of this, or is it not just based on your?
It's not a personal revelation whatsoever. I've not ever. People talk about feeling things all the time, and it's never been me. I've never felt anything.
So then I'm concerned because it's like you trust someone like Paul or the apostles.
No, but I'm not trusting just on their words, though. It's talking about corroboration. Corroboration that's a critical thinking thing. We have to be able to corroborate what the claims are. I believe that there's enough corroborative evidence to verify the facts, including non-Christian sources that inadvertently verify some of the facts of the Gospels, including miracles.
Well, it seems though that what I can grant to you is that people experience something, and that maybe the corroboration gets you to that. Okay, that's cool, but I don't know that gets you to that the event has evidence that it actually happened. The fact that they corroborated on,
if someone makes a claim, that's evidence. The question is,
a claim is not evidence. A claim is a claim. Evidence is independent. That's the problem that we're raising, is that they're making claims. It becomes
evidence whenever it's corroborated.
I disagree.
No, because if I have, like, look,
so if I take 100,000 eyewitness testimony in trials,
but if I have an eyewitness or something, and I committed a crime in New York, and I'm here in Georgia or something, and they're like, you committed this crime, and I corroborate with all these people that, like, they're like, no, he was here with me, right?
That's how they prove you weren't there. That's exactly what we're talking about. They're using
but
their eyewitness testimony.
The problem is that in those cases, we can independently verify the claims of the person saying that I wasn't there. We can't do that for the Gospels. We're just literally taking. How are you going in? How are you abductively doing that? Because we have extra biblical references as well as internal references that for facts that we can verify. Like the Romans, for example, they could have produced the body if they could. If they had it, they could have squashed Christianity in the very beginning. Why didn't they produce the body if they killed him and the body was still there? If they threw it in a mass grave, which is totally consistent with the time, then we would not know, right? I mean,
but you're assuming a mass grave.
You're assuming a resurrection.
I'm not assuming.
I have evidence for a mass grave. We don't have any evidence for resurrections. We have evidence for people making claims.
I understand that you say there's no evidence for resurrection, but what you're saying is there's no evidence. We're talking about Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, I'm saying mine is by default better because I actually have some data point in antiquity where
there are no historians that disagree that Jesus was buried in that tomb by himself. There's no historian, secular or otherwise, that disagree with that fact.
Where's the tomb? Where's the tomb?
Well, hold on a second. Can I just?
I don't know of any tomb. Where is it?
Let me just jump in real quick because there's one crucial difference here. Eyewitness testimony is not going to be the same across, like, if you're making an eyewitness testimony, I mean, in general, eyewitness testimony is unreliable, even in trials.
Well, I demonstrated why that is, but I showed how you can still determine facts from the eyewitness testimony based on corroboration.
Yes, but I think it matters that the way in which you determine facts are based on things that already have a prior level of empirical evidence to instill their reality as an actual phenomenon in the first place.
Which means you would rule out a miracle even if it happened. That's what I'm saying.
Only if what you're telling me is a miracle is real because all these people collaborate on the belief in the claim that it is real. That's the problem. If we, maybe not science, but some other tool that I haven't heard from yet. And the other thing I want to say real quick is that, like, I think there are different types of claims. So, like, eyewitness testimony, like if I say that I went to, I don't know why I'm thinking this, but a Rage Against the Machine concert, right? That's a very different type of claim, even if I'm talking about eyewitness testimony of people who might have seen me there.
Well, I think if I'm just interrupting you because I think I know where you're going. So Hitchens has a quote where he says that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think that you can't really validate that claim because on one level, every historical event ever is an extraordinary event because how many odds had to occur for that to occur? Now, you would say that there's empirical verification, or we've seen things like these, so it's plausible that it could have happened, but you're talking about plausibility. But I think that you still ruled out the possibility of a miracle because even if I could, so historical evidence and eyewitness testimony, that's all I have. I'm admitting it. But I think that their claims can be corroborated the same way that they can be that I can corroborate any historical claim. I believe 9/11 happened. I wasn't there, but I think there's plenty of evidence to demonstrate that it did happen. Plenty of eyewitness testimony.
This is the crucial difference. I think that you're not recognizing that the type of claim that we're making when we say something like 9/11 happened or something like George Washington existed is an entirely different type of claim than when we're talking about resurrections or miracles, because the first type of claim has a history of an empirical basis. Like, yes, history talks about what most likely happened in the past. I don't see history as this perfect vessel of truth creation, right? I think it talks about what likely happened given the tools that we have. If I say that somebody, like I said, I have no problem with the idea that Jesus existed. But now when you're talking about a resurrection, you're moving into a space of an event that can't be verified in the same way that we can verify somebody existing or war.
That's exactly the point. I'm not claiming that Jesus did a funny dance and danced around. I'm claiming that he rose from the dead. By definition, that's a different claim. So, and I think though that there's minimal facts that we can know historically, and there's only based on the minimal facts approach. Now, there's people that try to choose one of the alternate explanations, such as Jesus was the swoon theory. There's that Jesus never died. Well, that's also the swoon theory, that his disciples stole his body, which is what the Jews claimed. All these different things. It's called the minimal facts approach. Gary Habermas has gone over it anyway. So the minimal facts approach, there's only one explanation that has no liabilities, unless you count the liability that it was a resurrection itself. And if that's a liability, then it seems that you're starting with the conclusion or starting with the assumption that miracles don't happen. But I'm making a claim that a miracle happens to begin with. Well, you're shaking your head, but whenever you started, you said that I would only take like empirical evidence. I would take how are you going to convince me unless it's empirical? Okay. What other tools do you have? And the only tools I have, admittedly, are historical evidence.
Okay, so let me answer a question.
Okay.
Because I'm not making any claim about. So the difference here is between ontology and epistemology. Like, what is actually the case, or what is possible, and what is real or isn't real. I'm not actually making any claim about about that, because I would have to possess all possible knowledge to know one way or another. I don't have that, so I'm not saying that miracles are impossible.
I don't think you're saying that they're impossible. I'm just saying that
I'm talking about what we can justify empirically, or no, I'm sorry, what we can justify in terms of epistemology.
Well, there's also an issue you can run in it.
Please tell me what you're going to say, Mike. But I found my quote, by the way, and it has to do exactly with what he just said.
So
sure.
Yeah,
you said in one of your videos.
I can hold it. So if you want to go ahead.
Well, let me just finish the statement real quick. So again, I'm not saying that miracles are impossible. I'm saying that I don't think you're providing historical evidence for a miracle, because I think in principle history can't make claims.
That's what I was about to say.
That's not to say that I'm saying miracles are impossible. It's to say that
it's the wrong scope for
it's a wrong scope, but also that the problem that I have with theism is that the tools that it tries to use, we don't have any grounds to differentiate between the claims being imaginary as opposed to being something that actually corresponds to reality. Now, science, to some degree, that's why I value empiricism, even though I'm not an empiricist fully. Some of what science does, because of the tools that it has, the scope that it has, seems to do a better job at grounding its claims to be beyond purely imaginary. Again, that's not to say imaginary ontologically, but imaginary in terms of what we can justify epistemically. So I'm saying, okay, I'm willing, if you have a tool that you think can bridge the gap between the imaginary and the, not even the actual, but the potential, just to show that there is a possibility outside of just an epistemic technicality, but a possibility that resurrections are real because they're an actual phenomena, then I'm open to whatever tools you have.
So you've got, well, this is your quote, and then this is regarding what we're talking about. To disprove God, you would have to have all possible knowledge, or to prove him. To disprove him or prove him, you'd have to have all possible knowledge. But that seems like the problem in the beginning, because you're basically having to, that means you're going to have to assume God to even prove God, to have all possible knowledge. And that seems a contradiction, because you're saying to have all possible knowledge, that's the only way to know whether God exists or not. Then it seems like you've ruled it out in advance. And it also seems that if you're asking for another tool, I live in the same universe as you do. I can only verify historical facts based on things that can be corroborated, based on things that we can find on the ground to show that there was a city here. I have the same tools that you do to verify any historical events. I don't have anything that you don't have. And I guess whenever you ask, how can I test? If you think about it hypothetically, if you agree, if you hypothetically entertain that Jesus did do what I said he did, then you have not left your way to find the truth regarding that, because no historical evidence could ever prove it to you. You've already ruled it out.
Well, the issue, the historical part, this is what I wanted to say is, like, when we talk about it, a historical scope, it's going to be an abductive method, right? As opposed to like an inductive.
Abductive reasoning, I agree, yeah.
Yeah, but abductive methods in history is going to deal with what's most likely the case, most likely probable, given the data that we have. Okay,
I agree.
Yeah, but miracles are events that are improbable. And so now we have our issue. We have something that has a scope of dealing with what's most likely probable to explain an improbable event, right? And so we can just, if we wrote that into an argument, we could conclude that history is not the proper scope to deal with miracles, given that they're improbable events.
Is the other things regarding the context of the resurrection, they would have the same flaw. You could demonstrate the probability, and it's incredibly improbable that a resurrection would happen. But if you talk about the alternate possibilities based on the facts that we have on the minimal facts approach, then you have a very difficult problem not believing under the circumstances.
I don't know that I agree.
I believe what I do.
So I completely disagree with that.
I was going to say, I know, like, me and Cease, I think one of the first things that we got when we met each other on Discord in these conversations were talking to people about the minimal facts. I think that was like me and his like first kind of like duo together in terms of these conversations, and they've never been compelling to us, and we've always had the same kind of
Well, they
statement
would
of
be if
I
you
can
hold
just
historical
I can
truth from the
grant them
beginning.
all. I can grant whatever the person wants in the cases, and it still can't get you to what's most likely probable, given that the thing in question is an event that's improbable. I mean,
But by definition, it would be improbable. It wouldn't if it was a phenomenon that happened every day. It could never be what we're claiming it is in the first place. So it's a contradiction to suggest, well, if miracles were common, then I'd believe in them. But that would
I get
definition.
I get that. That's the problem of it being a miracle, and then applying a scope that deals with what's most likely probable.
But it's only a problem if you start with that assumption.
It would be a contradiction to say that a miracle is the most likely event that happened, because a miracle, by which you agreed and you've conceded, is an event that is improbable. That we would literally have P and not P. We literally have our contradiction.
No, we don't, because
we do.
You're talking about
the
other
scope,
facts, and you're assuming that those facts are more probable, and they're not.
No, I'm saying that we have a scope that deals with what's most likely probable, and a phenomena that we've conceded is an improbable event. The second we say this method can, which deals with what's most likely probable, concludes that this improbable event is most likely probable, is a contradiction, right? You can't say
it's not a contradiction, because
it is.
It's not the most improbable based on the circumstances of the context. The context makes it a reasonable case.
So let me just deal with that, because
I know you wanted to say something.
A number of things were said. One is that if you had all possible knowledge, you would somehow, you said something about you would be making an assumption, and I didn't know what you meant.
I was just quoting you, which is to disprove God, you'd have to have all possible knowledge, or to prove God. And I disagree that you would have to have all possible knowledge, because that would seem like you'd have to basically believe first and then work backwards. And I don't think that makes sense.
You couldn't, but you couldn't be making assumptions if you already had all the possible knowledge.
Yeah, he's just saying an agent has. So we have a possible world, and in that possible world we have an agent, and that agent in that possible world knows all true propositions, right? And then under one of those propositions that it would know is true is the proposition God exists.
Right. Now you also said
so it would just be the case that in order to disprove all those types of gods that you could come up with, not just two properties that contradict each other, but any god, you would have to have that knowledge. Sorry, go ahead.
You have the same problem if you're saying that a resurrection becomes more likely when you look at the context of all the other available evidence. And I'm saying that I disagree with that fundamentally, because I don't think.
I will let you continue. Just if you're already not convinced that God exists, then that wouldn't be probable. I am convinced first that God exists, and then it seems likely if God does exist, then he would do something like Jesus did. That's all.
But that's exactly the problem.
So you're like a presuppositionalist then.
No, I didn't presuppose God exists. I'm convinced that he exists based on the available evidence, which would lead me back to the Big Bang discussion we were having earlier.
Yeah, but wouldn't you have, in order to know the referent of what you believe in, wouldn't you have to have prior knowledge of the scriptures?
No, because scriptures don't inform my belief in God.
You're saying God's simpliciter, just God.
I don't know what you mean by that.
Simpliciter, just God, like just not like any attachment to a religion, but theism. And then you're saying you're making a more like granular type.
I believe that there's enough evidence to conclude a God structured and ordered the universe, and if that God exists, then it's reasonable one of the religions probably knows something about it.
Yeah. So again, all those steps.
I was kind of seeing the severity of the claim. That's all I was trying to say.
From my perspective, I don't see any reason. And again, it's not that as a matter of principle, I am rejecting the possibility of anything being the case. What I'm saying is that the context and the facts around Jesus' life and resurrection, even the parts of the Bible that can be said to be historical, to me, in no way, shape, or form add any more level of credibility to the supernatural claims found in the religion. Even if a God existed, which again is also a claim that I don't think can be justified philosophically in a way that's been convincing to me, it wouldn't follow from God exists, or we have good reason to believe that God exists, to therefore one of our religions likely knows something about the God. I don't see why that follows.
If God exists in the way that I define him, or I have found that he is defined, not defined in myself, because I believe that we should try to match what we believe based on reality, what a reality appears to be. Yeah, actually, you had to move to 6 because I assume something's coming up, right?
No.
No, I just have to. I haven't slept in like, I don't know.
Well, we haven't.
I should probably cut it soon anyway. Anyway, what I believe is that I have found, or that my belief in God matches the God that actually exists. And if that God has infinite knowledge, well, that definition is going to cause a can of worms. Anyway, if God has enough knowledge and power to create the universe with the precision that it appears to manifest, then that God can't have made me by accident, which means he would be interested in humanity and what he's doing. Because, I mean, you can't have that level of precision to something and then not know what it's doing, know what's like. I mean, any engineer that makes anything knows its parts perfectly. They know the ins and outs of it.
There seems to be, to me, to be so many assumptions there. Like I can, build a raft and then set it to sea and never see that raft again.
That's not the same thing at all. We're talking about, like, what's the word for those devices that do all those complicated things to perform a simple task? Rube Goldberg machine. So those things, they're incredibly detailed. They haven't, like, they're marvels. Actually, I like to watch them. They're pretty great. But the thing is, someone who made that with its function is going to know the inner workings of it. That raft, even that example, someone's going to know how they tied the ropes together. If they see that raft later, they're going to go, well, I tied that one. That one's mine.
Oh, sure.
They know the details of what they made.
Oh, no, I agree with that. No, I agree that God would know, but that doesn't mean that God would care, or that then we would have access to the nature of that God.
Okay, no, there's more details to that. So God would know first. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, would he care? And to me, I mean, I think that, like you, that humans have intrinsic value. I think that follows. I think we have moral desires. We think people matter. We think, now, obviously, we convince ourselves of and make mistakes and do things that we consider morally abhorrent. But I think that, and you've talked about morality and things, but I think that good exists, and I think evil exists. And if good exists, then I think there has to be a source for it. Now, you would argue moral realism, that you can found real morals with arguments and so on. But from what I can tell, good and evil exists. Good, to me, would be unrecognizable if it didn't. Like, how would we recognize the difference if there was no good and evil? And I think that that's another one of those presuppositions. I mean, it seems to me evident that good and evil exist. And so love exists, hate exists. And if those things exist, then where does that come from? A God that doesn't have love, that doesn't have good, I don't think it'd be like saying that something that doesn't have the sufficient power could create something beyond itself. And I don't think that makes sense. So if God can create us with these aspects, then I think it does follow that God would be interested in his creation.
There is a lot there that I think is really problematic.
Pick one.
I'm trying to think because of time. I'm trying to think of what. Let's do this. Would you be willing to come back?
Sure.
Because I if nothing else, I appreciate your approach. I just think that there's fundamentally some problems there with the way that we look at evidence. Let's put this on hold for a time being, because we're about to hit the 1:30 mark. How about, I'll shoot you a message and maybe we can set something up for next week or later this week if you're available.
I'm glad to do it, but honestly, it is difficult to find opportunities. So I don't know that I can do it that soon.
Okay.
But I guess we'll just have to communicate on TikTok or something else or whatever. I'd love to, but I have a lot going on.
Trust me, I understand. I have a lot as well. And I hope that at some point in the future.
You're wearing a Zelda shirt?
Yeah.
Nice. That's awesome.
Best video game ever.
You just got some massive points there at the end.
You
saved yourself. No, I'm just kidding.
And one thing I can do is maybe Mike and I can do a review of this conversation, and then I'll send you the episode. And then by the time you come back on, you can have some responses to some of our objections that we didn't get to because of time.
Sure.
So, but yeah, well, let's stay in touch, and we'll figure out a schedule. Whenever you're free, you're more than welcome to come back.
Well, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I'm going to just state it, obviously. My goal, I'm not trying to convince you of God or that Jesus existed. I'm trying to show you that not all theists are idiots.
Yeah, we don't hold them.
No, I know you're not assuming that anyway, but
I have a lot of
the thing
friends
is,
that are theists that are brilliant people. I just don't think that that's a brilliant choice. That's all, or a reason. Yeah.
No, and just to put this on the record, like even just on the show, we've had theists on that I respect intellectually, and I don't think that I'm in principle incapable of being convinced. I do think there are certain errors in your thinking that you've made.
Well, that's why we're here, because we're both under that belief.
Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I think you're stupid, because I don't.
Yeah.
I think that, and I think you're...
Well, my opinion on that, or my comment on that, was that it some of your TikTok conversations have been a little less enlightened, I guess. Not from you.
For sure.
No. not from you, but just...
And I do think that, and this is something that I'm trying to fix, but I get kind of triggered easily. I would much rather have a conversation with theists on TikTok that somebody that I legitimately respect intellectually. It's just the case that I get trolled by the bottom of the barrel type of people that come on my page and threaten me with stuff.
You're lucky, because I get people like Cece where I'll go to a random YouTube channel, right? Nothing about me, and he'll be there in the comments. Yeah, well, this guy J Mike, he's such an idiot, blah 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 blah. And so I just want to give a shout out to Cece for always like obsessing over me. I don't know how much time you dedicate out of your life. I want to reciprocate to you that I don't invest any. So this is the one thing you get. You get it right here. Hi, Cece. That's all you get. So, but also, I see you in those YouTube comments projecting. I see it.
Also, I don't think that TikTok is a good platform.
It's not.
For conversation.
That's what I hate inspired me to talk about it here, because I was like, we kept like cutting off. It's like,
yeah, and I appreciate you coming on. And like I said, I would love to have you back on. And I think there's a lot more here to unpack. I think we've just started kind of hitting the groundwork for future conversations where we can go more into detail.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But yeah, so we'll stay in touch. And with that said, I'm probably gonna have another. Oh, did he just leave?
Yeah, I might have had to get rolling. It's all good.
Gotcha.
I gotta get going myself too.
Yeah.
But no, that was a good conversation. CP is on to me.
I don't know.
CP is on to me.
Wait,
he found out my gimmick. It's attached to the hat. It's not really real hair, but anyway. Yeah,
I would say the kind of apologetics or presuppositionalism that I saw from, I think it was CC. Oh, he's back.
He's back.
Sorry, accident. I bumped the button.
No You're good. We assumed as much, so you're all good. No worries.
But yeah, the kind of apologetics that I was seeing CC type in the comments were really problematic. We've addressed some of that already in the past, but maybe we'll do it again in the future. But yeah, that said, I want to just say thank you everybody for tuning in. We had a really good crowd today. So thank you everybody for supporting us, and I'll probably be coming out with another episode tomorrow or the day after, kind of going over some of the stuff that I've been dealing with and what's been making me think about. Daniel, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll definitely have you back for another conversation.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, and everybody else, if you want to support us, just Axioms on Trial, or just subscribe. Or Axioms on Trial, Patreon. There you go, that thing. You know where it is. We love you. We'll see you tomorrow or the next day, or when we'll definitely have more shows this week. Cease will come on for that. I think I'll be able to make that one if we do it tomorrow. So look for us tomorrow. If not, look out for the community post of a picture of me and Cease that we want to share. We got to actually meet. We're real people that got to touch, not in the sexual way. Okay, maybe a little bit. No, just kidding. All right, guys, see ya.